Hello everyone, welcome to the fifth video of the Payments Byte series. In this video, we're going to look into e-commerce transactions, specifically how does 3D Secure work. So what are we going to look in this video? In this video, we will cover the fundamental differences between e-commerce transactions and terminal-based transactions. And with respect to 3D Secure e-commerce transactions, who are all the parties involved? Specifically the new parties that are involved for an e-commerce transaction and the transaction flow of an e-commerce transaction. I'm going to take into consideration 3D Secure version 1.0 as I speak through in this particular video. Before we start looking at an e-commerce transaction, let's look at few basics. For every payment transaction, irrespective of the type of transaction, be it a terminal or an e-commerce, what are the important validations that happen? First thing is to check if the card is valid. For example, when we take a plastic to a merchant, merchant first checks if the card looks valid and is of a valid banks. Also, in case of a magnetic stripe card, the track data behind the card that is present inside the black stripe behind the card gets validated. In case of an EMV card, the issuer puts a bunch of keys inside the chip card which gets validated when the card is presented at a terminal. Second most important thing is to authenticate if a cardholder is valid. How do we do it? We check if the PIN entered by a customer is valid, or in case of a signature based transaction, the merchant checks if the signature signed on the receipt is same as what is present behind the Magstripe card. So why are we discussing this? In case of an e-commerce transaction, there is no merchant or store person to physically verify the plastic or the customer, nor the physical plastic can interact at the time of a transaction. That's why we have to understand the different parties involved in an e-commerce transaction. Let's look at the different parties in case of an e-commerce transaction. I'm sure all of us would have done an e-commerce transaction in a website. Before we go further, let's look at the various parties involved. I've tried to provide screenshots so that we can relate. First thing is a merchant website where we see a payment page where all the card details can be entered. We see these are pretty much standard and these are basically a merchant plugin provided by the payment gateway. When a merchant ties up with a payment gateway provides a standard plugin for merchants for integrating them onto their website. The fields that you see, the card number, the name, the CVC, the expiry date, or credit debit, these forms are actually provided by the payment gateway. Second thing is the payment gateway itself. It is a server component for a web merchant. That is, it maintains the relationship with the web merchants. And it also provides the merchant plugin that we just spoke of. A payment gateway acts like a terminal acquirer switch. That is, in case of a terminal-based transaction, the terminal is provided by the acquirer and the terminal interacts with the acquirer switch. Similarly, for an e-commerce transaction, the merchant website integrates with the payment gateway. A payment gateway also maintains relationships with the schemes as well. The next important party is the access control server. It is an issuer side web application, that is the card issuer side web application, which helps to authenticate the customer based on OTP or any other password. I'm sure many of us would have seen the screen that is on the right side of this slide, where the user is asked to enter the password. This particular page is provided by the issuer ACS. Lastly, a directory server, which is hosted by the schemes like MasterCard, Visa, RuPay, etc. It acts as a directory providing the URL of all the issuer ACS. Basically, it contains the URL website's URL of all the issuer ACS applications. This directory is referenced by the merchants whenever needed when an e-commerce transaction is performed. Now let's look into e-commerce transaction steps. Unlike a normal POS transaction, in an e-commerce 3D secure transaction, the transaction happens in two passes. First step is where the cardholder is authenticated using the ACS, and upon successful authentication, the second step, The transaction would be submitted to the schemes like a normal POS transaction, that is through a payment gateway to schemes and further to issuer. And finally, the issuer validates the transaction. Now let's look into a 3D secure transaction flow. Firstly, the card details are captured at the merchant website and are sent to the payment gateway. That is a server component. Server further forwards the request to the directory server. The directory server, as we said, is hosted by the schemes. The directory server checks if the card number and the card range is valid and is eligible for 3D secure. If so, it also returns a directory server URL. The server plugin provides the ACS URL to the merchant website. Basically, both merchant website and the server plugin works in tandem to redirect the page to the issuer ACS. This three steps are also called as verification request and response. You would have heard VER that is verification request as well. These terminologies are used in case of a 3D secure transaction. And the fourth step is where the merchant URL is redirected to the issuer ACS website. You can usually observe that when this redirection happens in the web page, the web address also gets changed to the issuer ACS. The issuer ACS authenticates the customer by an OTP or a password. The issuer ACS works closely with the issuer CMS systems, and it has all the information that is the demographic information, and also has the capability to record a password. The ACS shares unique keys with the issuer, which only the issuer and the ACS knows. And upon successful authentication, the issuer ACS generates AAV or CAVV values. And this information is provided to the payment gateway, that is the merchant server plugin. And upon successful authentication, the payment gateway sends an authorization message to the schemes. This is like any other normal POS transaction. And schemes further sends this particular transaction to the issuer who validates this AAV and CAVV and sends the response back to the merchant server plugin and to the merchant. And that's how a decision happens. So in a 3D secure transaction flow, we came to know about new parties that are involved, namely the payment gateway and the merchant plugin and the merchant website. And most importantly, the directory server, which hosts the URL of all the issuer ACS systems and the issuer ACS system itself. Thank you for listening to the video. I'd be happy to see any feedback or queries or suggestions. Do like the video if you learned something from it.